I'm very grateful to be here on this panel of amazing women, and I'm also very grateful to the DC Public Library for having this event, because as Megan described, the Vancouver Public Library had a very difficult time. This is a really difficult conversation to have, but we absolutely have to be having it. So thank you all for being here today. So I was asked to be here to talk about some developments in the law in the United States. And I will do that by sort of putting laws into two separate categories. One being the conversations that are happening at the courts, both at the federal level and at the state level. And the second category being what's happening before Congress. So in the courts, we should go back to May of 2016, when then President Obama issued a letter to schools saying that schools must consider the word sex to mean gender identity for purposes of Title IX. So what does that mean? Title IX is a statute that was enacted in 1972 specifically to protect women and girls in the educational arena. That's its core purpose. It exists to protect women and girls because women and girls had been discriminated against in and excluded from the educational arena for so long. And feminists were successful in getting Title IX passed. And the word sex is used in the law itself, as well as in the regulations. So what Title IX says is you can't discriminate against women and girls in the educational arena. But there are also regulations associated with Title IX that say, even though you can't discriminate against women and girls, it's okay to have separate facilities like bathrooms and locker rooms and changing rooms on the basis of sex. The regulations specifically permit that. What President Obama said is that what the word sex means in the regulations and in the statute is gender identity. So, Women's Liberation Front, of which I'm the board, decided to sue President Obama in a lawsuit called WoLF versus United States of America. And we proceeded on that, basically making two arguments. One was that the guidance that President Obama had issued was done with no notice and comment, and we construed that as a violation of something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which says that if the government is going to make substantive changes in regulations, you have to let the public know and you have to let the public weigh in. President Obama did not do that, so that was our main complaint. But our other complaint was that interpreting sex to mean gender identity for the purposes of Title IX completely erases women and girls as a category, and Title IX was specifically enacted to protect women and girls. Okay, so that was our lawsuit. Then along came the current administration, which withdrew the lawsuit. So what that meant is that our lawsuit was dismissed with our agreement because it became moot, because the guidance was formally no longer in place. However, the withdrawal of that guidance didn't really help because schools had gotten the guidance and schools were scrambling to figure out, what does this mean? Are we allowed to have sex segregated bathrooms anymore? What are we supposed to do? They were really given no specific concrete guidance about what the guidance meant. So schools were scrambling to figure it out. In the meantime, across the country, you had trans-identified kids suing their schools for not letting their schools into the opposite sex bathrooms. So what that meant is that these cases were sort of bubbling up through the courts at the federal and state level. So WoLF weighed in a couple of other cases, and I'll talk about two of them. One is the Gloucester Case. So this is a case from Virginia where a female student who identifies as male sued her school for not allowing her to use the boys' room. And that case went up, and it actually went before the Supreme Court. But what happened is when the current administration withdrew the guidance, the Supreme Court kicked it back down to the appeals court. So that case is just sort of bubbling along. But the Women's Liberation Front submitted a friend of the court brief in that case to say, listen, you have to take us seriously. We are a group of women and girls. Interpreting sex to mean gender identity for Title IX purposes erases women and girls. We're not okay with that. So that case continues to go along. The other case I'll just talk briefly about is called Boyertown. This case started in a suburb of Philadelphia where it's actually quite different. This is a group of students who sued their school district because they said, we want sex-segregated bathrooms. And the school had implemented a policy of allowing any student to use any bathroom that aligned with their self-declared gender identity. So the students sued the school because they wanted sex-segregated spaces. We filed a friend of the court brief in that case as well. encouraging the Supreme Court to take it up. The only one of the students who has come out publicly as one of the plaintiffs in that case is a young woman named Alexis Lightcap. She's absolutely brilliant, and she's extremely brave because she's speaking out on this. So we were very happy to weigh in on that case. And we're hoping that the Supreme Court will take up the question of what the words sex and gender identity even mean for purposes of the law. That's the course. We're just sort of waiting to see whether the Supreme Court will take up this question. We think it's a really important question to take up. We think the Boyertown case is a really great case in which to do that because there's a girl who is a plaintiff, and we're hoping we'll get before the Supreme Court. Just of note, in our brief in that case, we mentioned Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg founded the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, which now is advancing the cause of gender identity, unfortunately. And we mentioned in our brief in that case something along the lines of, certainly the people who founded the ACLU's Women's Rights Project knows the category of people whose rights they were trying to protect. One has to assume. Okay, so that's what's going on in the courts. And what's going on in the legislature is there's a bill pending before the House of Representatives and before the Senate called the Equality Act. Sounds great, right? Who could be against equality? Equality is a good thing. What the Equality Act, so-called, would do is amend the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the legacy of Dr. King. It would amend it to add gender identity to the list of protected categories against which you cannot discriminate in places of public accommodation. This would be an unmitigated disaster for everybody, but particularly for women and girls, who would no longer, under the law, be able to claim any right to a sex-segregated space. We currently struggle with that now as cities and states across the country abolish sex-segregated spaces, so it's a fight anyway. But if it goes into federal law, it is an unmitigated disaster for women and girls. It's pending before both the House and the Senate. We predict that it will pass the House, and so our strategy is to do what we can do to get gender identity out of the Equality Act before the Senate. But it wouldn't only obliterate sex-segregated spaces in places of public accommodation. It would also say that any entity that receives federal funding, which is a lot of entities in this country, would have to consider the word sex to mean gender identity. So the Equality Act is more of an unmitigated disaster than it even would be if it only amended the 1964 Civil Rights Act to include gender identity as a category that cannot be discriminated against in places of public accommodation. What this effectively means, if we construe the word sex to mean gender identity, what we are saying is that women and girls do not exist as a category worthy of civil rights protection. And feminists have been fighting for hundreds of years in this country and for thousands of years in other places to fight for the rights of women and girls in many arenas, but for my purposes, in the legal and policy arena. And we have made really, really important wins. And I do not want to see those pulled back. So that's really all I have to say. Thank you so much for having me here today.
The universal mission of libraries is to provide equitable access to information and to facilitate and protect the right to freely pursue knowledge. And yet our public library made intentional choices to attempt to limit access to our event and to actively discourage people from attending and deciding for themselves what to think about the issue at hand. Our brand new mayor in Vancouver, when asked to comment on the event and on my position, said he thought it was despicable. He said this despite having no idea what would be discussed at the event, nor what my position actually is, and despite the fact that myself and the organizers had received numerous violent, misogynist, sexualized threats through Eventbrite. That is what he should have called despicable, not the women trying to stand up for and have a conversation about their rights. And this is common for people to smear those of us asking questions about gender identity ideology and legislation without actually engaging with what we're saying. So I'm very grateful to the 300 people who showed up courageously at the Vancouver Public Library to have this conversation, knowing they could be potentially targeted, harassed, and smeared themselves for doing so. And I'm also grateful to you all who have shown up today to have this conversation and to fight back against the incredibly frightening and dangerous silencing that's going on right now in the faces of what is harmful, regressive, sexist ideology and legislation. I am not a cis woman. I do not identify with the stereotypes imposed on me as a woman. I am not passive. I will not stay silent. I will not sit down and shut up, and I will fight back. Co-founder and CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, said, "I want to start by making something very clear. We don't consider political viewpoints, perspectives, or party affiliation in any of our policies or enforcement decisions, period." Later in the hearing, he reiterated, "Our policies and our algorithms don't take into consideration any affiliation, philosophy, or viewpoint," which is weird because in November, my account was locked for saying men aren't women and for asking what's the difference between a trans woman and a man. I don't actually consider these political views. To say that men aren't women is to simply state a material reality pretty much everyone on the planet would or should agree on. And to ask what the difference is between a trans woman and a man is an attempt to attack the logic behind gender identity ideology, which claims mainly that trans women are not male but female. I was asking another Twitter user what the difference is between a trans woman and a man, not to be a jerk, not to harass, not to be facetious, but because I genuinely want to know what it is trans activists believe happens between male and trans women that defines a trans woman as separate from male. No one has ever been able to answer this question for me. I don't know, maybe someone will be able to today, we'll see. Just this month, Jack Dorsey told Rolling Stone in a response to a question about how Twitter is dealing with harassment and false information on the platform, "We can't be the arbiters of truth." So Twitter is not the arbiter of truth, nor do they take political views into consideration when banning people from their platform, unless, of course, a woman speaks the truth about biological sex or tries to hold a predatory man accountable for his behavior, in which case Twitter is incredibly swift in determining truth and whether or not a man should be protected from accountability. So that sounds legit. It also sounds like 1984. So a central theme, as I'm sure probably everyone here knows, in Orwell's book is about how political actors can distort language to increase their power and distort the public's understanding of reality. So in the book, the totalitarian government enforces the use of newspeak, which is a controlled language that prevents dissent and free thought. In newspeak, warm becomes uncold. And today, for gender identity ideology, woman becomes cis woman, which is to say that now woman exists, once again, only in relation to men and to gender stereotypes. We're no longer just women, i.e. females, but we're defined based on our relationship to gender stereotypes embraced by transgender ideology, which says that femininity defines womanhood, not having a female body. We're told that a man who prefers femininity is a woman, whereas an actual woman is a cis woman. Without consulting or alerting their users, Twitter adopted a modern version of newspeak and began retroactively banning users who failed to toe the line and who continue to call men he despite their trans identity or refer to them using their original legal names rather than the new names they adopted in order to erase their histories as men. They call this misgendering and dead naming, implying that people are somehow harmed when we acknowledge a person's biological sex or that they had a life prior to identifying as transgender. This is not true. And in fact, not knowing or acknowledging a person's biological sex is the thing that's potentially harmful. In any case, contrary to popular internet mythology, I was not actually banned for breaking Twitter rules. I was not banned because I said anything hateful or transphobic or bigoted. I was banned because I was discussing the behavior of a man who didn't want his behavior discussed. A man who still goes by his male name, though who also has adopted a female name which he seems to use selectively or alongside his male name. A man who's been going around to local estheticians in the Vancouver area where I live, asking them to give him a Brazilian bikini wax. So, in other words, he was knowingly trying to put women in an uncomfortable, unsafe situation where they would be forced to be alone in a room with a naked man. One who very clearly does not respect women's boundaries, because when these women declined to perform this service for him, saying the service is only offered for women, he tried to extort money out of these women and tried to take them to human rights court, claiming they were discriminating against him because he announced he was transgender. This whole situation is interesting because it's precisely what feminists have been warning would come of these new gender identity policies and laws being implemented across the world. So long as men are no longer men, the moment they declare it so, women no longer have the right to have boundaries. They can no longer defend women-only spaces. They can no longer say, no, I do not wish to be alone in a room with a naked man. No, this man may not access women's and girls' change rooms. No, this man may not be transferred to a female prison. No, this man may not join this woman's football team or compete in this woman's cycling race. And no, I do not wish to touch this man's genitals. Because now there's no such thing as a man and no such thing as a woman. Now, under gender identity ideology, sex does not exist, material reality doesn't exist, and we're all anything we say we are, and no one can challenge our claims. And women and girls are the ones suffering and being put in danger as a result of this, which is why I suspect no one seems to care. At least not those who have the power to do something. Politicians, the mainstream media, lawmakers, and corporate CEOs. And not only do these people in positions of power, people who have the ability to change laws and control public discourse, not care about women's rights and boundaries, but they're actively punishing and attempting to silence those of us who do care about women's rights and boundaries and who dare to speak up. Twitter executives have lied many times over, publicly and under oath. They have built a multi-billion-dollar company on lies. They've used the public to profit. They've used politics to profit. They've used revolutions and radicals and rebels to profit. Twitter has profited from movements like the Arab Spring, from hashtags like #MeToo, and from the notion that Twitter is a place for people who dissent. A place where people can hold where the public, the general public, can hold powerful figures and entities to account. This was all a lie. Because now women are being systematically punished and silenced for doing just that. For dissenting, for challenging the status quo, for telling the truth, and for trying to hold men and those in positions of power to account. Early on, Twitter was emphatic in its defense of free speech as a core value of the company. In 2013, the New York Times explained, Twitter has definitely built something of a reputation for protecting free speech, even unpopular speech. In March 2012, Twitter's then president, or vice president, Tony Wang, explained that generally we remain neutral as to the content because our general counsel and CEO like to say, we are the free speech wing of the free speech party. So free speech was never a minor detail lurking in Twitter's terms of service. It was, according to Twitter, the entire reason the platform was founded and the platform's most basic function. Its mission statement reads, the mission we serve as Twitter Inc. is to give everyone the power to create and share ideas and information instantly without barriers. Our business and revenue will always, oops, I get lost here. Got it. Follow that mission in ways that improve and do not detract from a free and global conversation. So, I guess women do not count as part of everyone, and according to Twitter, are not meant to be part of the free and global conversation. On its values page, Twitter states, we believe in free expression and believe every voice has the power to impact the world. So I guess Twitter just doesn't believe in the free expression of women. I guess Twitter doesn't think women's voices should have the power to impact the world. Twitter has repeatedly promised and represented that it would uphold the free speech rights of its users and not engage in viewpoint discrimination or censorship in its rules, public statements, and terms of service. These promises and representations were essential in attracting a critical mass of users to the platform, and they were very much central to the decision of millions of users to join. So I'm a person who has long expressed a socialist critique of capitalism and corporate power. My work has centered around holding men to account and challenging the status quo. How many radical feminists and socialists do you think would have joined Twitter if the company had said from the get-go that they intended to arbitrarily ban users who didn't agree with the political and social views of its corporate management? But just because Twitter doesn't like my opinions doesn't mean my opinions are hateful. Just because Twitter doesn't like women telling the truth about their friends who are potentially a danger to women, doesn't mean those women should be silenced. I think some people might see this conversation as unimportant. So, the world is bigger than Twitter, obviously. But today, Twitter is the public square. It's where public discourse happens. The New York Times publishes tweets in their articles. What is actually happening is that women are being banned from participating in public discourse. It's anti-democratic, it's misogynist, and it's wrong. I want to say that I'm very glad that we're holding this event in a library. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted the first ever public event discussing gender identity, ideology, and women's rights in Vancouver at the Vancouver Public Library. And something like 100 to 150 protesters showed up and stood outside the venue. I didn't see any of it firsthand, but afterwards was sent a video of a man shouting, "Trans women are women," at a group of mostly women, but some men also, who robotically repeated after him like drones. So we're seeing women silenced by men who are working to define women out of existence.
I'm Bree. I'm a spokesperson for Fourth Wave Now, and I want to ask everyone not to think about a blue bunny. Are social contagions real? Can you, as one leading US gender clinician asked me mockingly, catch trans like the flu? Kind of. Suicide, divorce, eating disorders, crime, a smile, a yawn, all contagious behaviors. Thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can all travel across social networks, infecting those who come into contact with them. This is how culture is created and how it spreads. It's how learning happens. Sometimes it happens on a rational level and sometimes not. It sounds scary, right? Not really. If you admit that you don't have complete conscious control over the things that influence you, you're less likely to be susceptible to subconscious influences. Another caveat, the stronger a need or a desire is, the stronger an outside influence will be. Our goals radically change our preferences and our behaviors. They're adaptive. But goals can't be planted from an external source without something already being present in a person that helps make that goal desirable. Negativity is contagious. Joy is also contagious. But there's no joy in any of this. In fact, gender ideology at its core is the belief that something is amiss, out of place, with how one feels alongside who one is. So what is it about gender ideology that turns people on? I want to tell you a few stories about how ideas and behaviors spread and how they might result in social contagions or psychic epidemics. In the 1960s, at a boarding school in Tanzania, a few girls started to laugh and then cry hysterically, and they couldn't stop. Within a few weeks, it had spread to 60% of the girls in the boarding school. Authorities tested the water, they gave the girls physicals, they invited in experts to try to figure out what was going on. and they couldn't find anything that was causing the fits. So in a panic, the school closed and sent all the girls home to their villages. That was a big mistake. The communities believed that the laughter and the crying were not only dangerous, but also uncontrollable, and that helped it spread. Eventually, over 1,000 people were infected, and 14 other schools had to close. Hysteria spreads when authorities react hysterically. You can't treat hysteria with hysteria. A brilliant woman I know, an entomologist, sometimes gets called in to help with hard cases of infestation that no other bug killer can eradicate. Inevitably, these infestations aren't real. There are no bugs. Yet the idea that there is an infestation and physical manifestations of that infestation, scabs or rash, appear in all of the people within that community, be it a workplace or a home. What my friend has found over the years is similar to what psychologists and epidemiologists who study the spread of hysterical laughter and crying, nausea and dizzy spells, sleeping sicknesses, and other somatic manifestations is that they're caused by stress. Stress, especially the kind of stress that is beyond your control, like miserable working conditions, makes people, women more than men, younger more so than older, most vulnerable to these kinds of contagions. They've happened in office buildings, the Indiana DMV, schools and universities, and within families. So what's stressing our young people? Why is the belief that there is some deep inner split between their bodies and their minds spreading so quickly? The newest poll tells us that 2% of US high school students are trans or non-binary. What is the underlying goal? What uncontrollable stressors are our primarily daughters reacting to? Another story. Researchers took two groups of smokers and they split them into two and they showed them a half-hour sitcom. Halfway through, one group watched an anti-smoking PSA while the other group watched a completely unrelated advertisement. Afterwards, 44% of the smokers who watched the anti-smoking PSA went outside to smoke, while only 11% of the group smokers who watched an unrelated commercial went outside. Anti-smoking ads that show cigarettes, even a bunch of dirty cigarette butts, or smoke, or even use the word cigarette or smoke, increase people's desire to smoke. Telling someone not to do a thing reminds them of that thing. Don't think of a blue bunny. You're thinking of a blue bunny, right? Some of you? Like a virus, ideas spread through vectors. In this case, the media and social networks. In nearly all instances, hysteria is built into the stories of trans people. Transition or suffer. Transition and suffer. Transition or die. Transition and die. We're all gonna suffer and we're all gonna die. A few years ago, Transgender Trend published a media analysis that looked at the most common themes and language used in stories about transgender youth. Not surprisingly, what they found was that the majority of articles use sex stereotypes, clothing, hair, toy preferences, as confirmation that a child was transgender. And also, that social transition was not only the way to lead a happier and more authentic life, but also the only way to avoid inevitable suicide. Almost half the articles noted medical transition as a good option, but only 5% noted that these could be a lifelong commitment, that long-term outcomes are unknown, that the majority of early onset dysphoric youth desist, or that sterility and sexual dysfunction are possible side effects of medical transition. We need to think of this as the upper layer of a viral transmission. Dominant narratives and collective consciousness is created through the media stories we consume. Is the world more or less violent today than it was 50 years ago? Your answer to that question will depend not only on your friends, but also on the media you engage with. So the dominant narrative being driven by the media is that some people have an innate sense of gender identity that's different than their natal sex, and that this identity comes not from someone's personality or preferences, but from somewhere deep inside. It's innate, sometimes fluid, sometimes set in stone by the time you're 3 years old. And that the only way to feel okay in the world, the way to be your authentic self, is to admit that you're really someone else, that you were misidentified at birth, and the social mores and biological rules foisted on you were a mistake. So this first vector, or the top layer of contagion, is how the general public is thinking about, or how they should, according to the influencers, be thinking about trans kids. But below that layer, and just as important, is the next vector, how young people themselves generate their understanding of identity, gendered and otherwise, and self in concert with their peers and the narratives they encounter. From the time our children are very young, today, they learn how to create virtual personas. Choosing an avatar is just as fun as the game itself. On Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, if teens use Facebook, we're encouraged to curate our personas. We are who and what we let people see. So already, the very act of creating an account on a specific platform involves thinking about your identity, who you are, who you want people to think you are. Labels are everywhere, and they offer a sense of belonging and meaning. For young people just beginning to develop a sense of identity, labels can be very attractive. It's important that parents and educators talk to young people about their identities. What groups do you belong to? Why do you belong to these groups? Can you identify out of or away from a particular group? Why or why not? What defines you? Base these conversations, when possible, in material reality. You are what you do in the world, and while there are some confining characteristics, skin color, sex, disability, these only define some aspects of who you are as a person and how the world reacts to you. The rest is up to you. Are you an artist? Are you kind? So a young person who hasn't thought too much about their gender identity joins Instagram or Tumblr, and what they find there is a peer group that defines itself through labels and categories created in opposition to something. In the case of many dysphoric or gender-interested young people, these categories feel like coming home. There's great relief in finally finding your tribe, a group of other outcasts bucking an oppressive system. This is important. Negative feelings are, for some reason, far more transmissible than positive ones. And the more intense the negative feeling, the wider and faster it spreads. We know this from Twitter and Facebook's sketchy research projects, where they manipulated people's timelines. Negative messages reached farther and faster than positive ones. Today's issue of The Guardian reports that the UK Secretary of Health has warned social media companies that they must remove content that glorifies self-harm and suicide, because young people are especially vulnerable to this kind of viral content. Imagine if the girls in the boarding school at Tanzania had YouTube. We know our young people are having a hard time. Rates of anxiety and depression are alarmingly high. Perfectionism, feeling left out and less than, all major contributors possibly to why girls in weird, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic countries are doing so poorly. Unlike boys, when girls struggle, they internalize. Jonathan Haidt summarizes this by saying that boys make others miserable, while girls make themselves miserable. And there is nowhere better to co-ruminate about how miserable you are thereby making yourself more miserable and passing the miserable vibe on to others, than on social media, where one is actually rewarded for your despair. Sadly, the more of a wreck you are, the more attention you receive from other young women. Many kids absorbed by the trans narrative are highly intelligent, exceptionally creative, socially awkward, socially isolated. There are more adoptive kids in trans populations than there should be. Many others have previous diagnoses, including high rates of ASD. This is important because early adopters are usually very different than late adopters of a social trend. What was known about gender dysphoric youth in years past oftentimes does not reflect the ever-increasing population of young people who, at this stage, we can consider late adopters. The first people ever to buy an iPhone were very different than the people who bought the second, third, fourth, 8th, 10th iPhone. Because the way gay has been transposed for trans, combined with many people having known at least one older, long-time trans person, there's a great deal of conflation. The exponential rise in especially young females who come to see themselves as trans is not at all reflective of gay and lesbian communities or their experiences, or the way early onset trans women of old developed. The mechanism that's been put into action at this point is any young person who feels uncomfortable with the stereotypes associated with their sex can quickly come to believe, thanks to media stories, memes, social media, BuzzFeed questionnaires, that this means there is something incongruous between their physical bodies and their minds. But no one feels comfortable with all the stereotypes associated with their sex. No male, no female, not a one of us. Feminists have been talking about this for a really long time. So what can we do? Can we disrupt the spread of harmful ideas and practices? We can try. Remember, responding hysterically spreads hysteria. Remember that anti-smoking ads make people want to smoke. Researchers found that attending group therapy for disordered eating leads to an increase in disordered eating. We have to be very careful about how we go about creating alternative stories, how we step in to interrupt a vector of contagion. Remember what I said earlier about goals? If you can determine the underlying goal of a young person in regards to transition, you'll be better able to help them meet those goals through other means. When the needs and desires are being met, they're far less likely to be susceptible to external influences. The best thing a parent can do is to keep their children's lives as open and as joyful as possible for as long as possible. Kids have plenty of time to hear about all that's wrong with the world. Burdening childhood with inevitable doom will not bode well if you want children to feel safe, secure, and resilient. Focus on gratitude and abundance and keep fear, resentment, and deprivation as far away as possible. Many of the currently trans or previously trans young people who I've talked to tell me that transition was a means to control their lives and their bodies when they felt out of control. Let young people have as much control over the things that they can: hairstyle, clothing, toys, activities, even their name. Control, hope, meaning, belonging, acceptance, a chance to invent and create and feel powerful. These are all some of the goals. These are the things that gender ideology that turns people on and draws them in. Make sure life is filled with these things already. No one wants to be open with someone who mocks or belittles their interest, and they certainly won't trust you if you do. Find some small strip of common ground, of appreciation, of curiosity. Don't react hysterically. Collectively, let's try to bring the pitch down a few notches, at least in terms of how we talk and think about youth. Let's try to separate them from the insidious erasure of female spaces and protections because on most levels, these are completely different issues, although they're being fueled by the same small group of individuals. We need to demand a national conversation. The proposed changes to law, which Carol will speak about soon, won't only eliminate female-only spaces, sports, or the safety afforded to vulnerable women in prisons and domestic violence shelters. These changes, if enacted, also limit a therapist's ability to peel back the layers of stress gripping a young person caught up with these ideas. Stand up. Each person who speaks honestly, rationally, and calmly about these issues without hiding behind anonymous hysteria creates space for a wider conversation. Bring that conversation to your families, to your children's schools, to your lawmakers and your community leaders. Each of you has the potential to give another person permission to think more deeply and to ask questions. And the way to do that is by being just, calm, and courageous. Step into the light. Your ideas, your questions, your concerns are nothing to be ashamed of if you convey them reasonably and listen with curiosity to other reasonable ideas. Each person who adds their voice to this discussion creates room for another person to stand up.
So there's the extraction, and then there's the supporting ideology. For women, the people on top are men. Around the globe, women faced constant insults to our intelligence, our bodies, and our lives. One example, the number one reason that women go to the emergency room is battering. So that's a man beating up a woman. And a man does that every 18 seconds in the United States. That is more hatred than I can comprehend. So this is a basic insight of feminism. Women share a common condition, and that condition is political. It's not bad luck, it's not choosing the wrong man, it's not created by evolution, and it wasn't ordained by God. None of these horrors are inevitable. Humans created them, humans can resist them. Which means our biology is not the problem. So according to the United Nations, sex is, quote, the biological and physiological characteristics that define men and women. Sex is simply a fact. Gender, on the other hand, is, quote, the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities considered appropriate for men and women. So that's the problem. Gender is the extraction and the supporting ideology. So for male dominance to continue, we all have to be socialized into it. Boys have to be molded into dominators. Being a man requires a psychology of entitlement, emotional numbness, and a dichotomy of self and other. As for femininity, that's just ritualized submission. Female socialization is a process of psychologically constraining and breaking girls, otherwise known as grooming, to create a class of compliant victims. Across history, this breaking has included so-called beauty practices, like female genital mutilation, like foot binding, as well as the ever-popular childhood sexual abuse. Femininity is just the traumatized psyche displaying acquiescence. Now, contrary to what you might have heard, gender is not a binary. It's a hierarchy, global in its reach, sadistic in its practice, murderous in its conclusion, just like race and just like class. Gender demarcates the geopolitical boundaries of patriarchy. It divides us in half, but it's not a horizontal half, it's vertical. Gender is not some cosmic yin and yang, it's a fist and the flesh that bruises. It's a mouth crushed shut and a little girl who will never be the same. Without feminism, the realities of women's lives are unspeakable, each woman cut adrift in a hostile, chaotic sea. Apply the words sex class to that chaos, and it snaps into a sharp pattern of subordination, from the small daily insults of body and soul to the shattering traumas of incest and rape. The crimes men commit against women are done because women belong to a subordinate class, and they're done to keep women a subordinate class. It's not personal, and it's not random. It's political, and it's unjust. Those unjust conditions are what Andrea Dworkin named the barricade of sexual terrorism. That barricade defines the parameters of gender. It's really simple. Women are inside it, men are outside it. Actually, men are building it, fist by fist and fuck by fuck. That's what men do to break us and keep us broken. And that's what gender is, the breaking and the broken. To get justice for women, we have to dismantle the caste system called gender. So that barricade of sexual terrorism, brick by brick, we have to bring it down. Not accommodate to it, not make the best decisions we can inside it, but bring it down. And now we come to the newest brick in that barricade, transgenderism. It is easily observed that humans are a sexually dimorphic species. This does not seem controversial, but the genderists consider it so. If you don't believe me, go online and make a statement that contradicts the Church of Gender. Here's one. The penis is a male organ. Straightforward, no hate speech. A basic biological fact. Go ahead and try it. And prepare for your life to be destroyed. Genderists insist that biology is a social construct, that there are, quote, lady sticks and girl dicks, and that heterosexual men, but especially lesbians, have a duty to try one. When anyone says no, they are called bigots and told to die in a fire. I wish I was making this up. When you ask them, well, what's a woman? And I encourage you to do that, their answer is invariably anybody who feels like one. Well, by that definition, I'm not a woman. I don't feel like one, and I have no actual idea what that would feel like. I don't feel like I'm 5'8", and I don't feel like I have gray hair. Probably because these things are not feelings. They're facts. Facts are not generated by feelings. You can look to the law, but it's not any clearer. So Massachusetts says gender identity is, quote, a person's gender-related identity. So a woman is anyone who feels like a woman, and gender identity is a gender-related identity, and a circle is a thing we call the circle. I mean, there's no there there. Meanwhile, every 18 seconds, a man is beating up a woman, and his fist is very much there. If you take out our bodies, what's left is the shell of gender. So those socially constructed roles, behaviors, and activities, the constraints, the grooming, the displays of submission, everything that women have been fighting, well, that's what the genderists say is real. Here's a quote. There is a distinct, substantive, immutable feminine gender, and it cannot be transcended. That is power speaking. Oh, it's cosmic, it's natural, it's the law of the universe, and there's no way out. Well, me and a long line of feminists beg to differ. We say gender is women's oppression, and we've got centuries of mutilated feet, mutilated genitals, and mutilated rib cages to back us up. They said, no, gender is great fun. The only problem is we don't get to choose between the dominant and the subordinate role. And some men really want the submissive role, and they're enraged when they are denied. Our solution is to dismantle male power. Their solution runs into trouble. If biology is a social construct, and if that construct is the problem, the solution should be to dismantle it. But they know in their hearts that biology is not a story that humans made up. They can't dismantle it. That's like saying dismantle gravity. So the best they can do is stop anyone from talking about it. And that is what is happening now, not just across the internet, but on college campuses, in medical offices, in sports, and on social media. Women can no longer talk about menstruation, abortion, pregnancy. In fact, we can't even use the word vagina without invoking the wrath of men. Our best outcome would be women's liberation. Their best outcome? Well, women are losing the ability to talk about sex-based oppression since sex doesn't exist. The women on the front lines are, as ever, the least of us. Women in homeless shelters, women in prisons, women in battered women's shelters, as well as schoolgirls, are being forced to share intimate spaces with men who claim to be women. The statistics show that such men have the same rate of criminality as other men. So they have the same rate of violent crime and the same rate of sexual crime. Across the English-speaking world, the dignity and safety of the most vulnerable women have been weighed against the feelings of sexual predators. And the feelings of these men have been declared more important. Feminists warned where this would end. And now here we are. Women have been sexually harassed, assaulted, and raped in shelters and prisons. I want everyone here to imagine the terror of being locked in an 8x10 cell with a convicted rapist. This is happening to women. I have spent much time reading the words of teenage girls who think they are transgender. It has broken my heart in ways that will never heal. In their own words, this is what makes them transgender. I like skateboarding. I like math. I want short hair. I don't want to shave my legs. I hate my body. They want physical freedom, a life of intellectual pursuits, and bodily integrity. They want to be human beings, not objects. This is from Helena, a detransitioned young woman. Quote, "At first, it wasn't I'm a boy, it was I'm anything besides a girl, as if it was a dirty word, the way boys say it on the playground. My goal went from diet pills to testosterone, from fantasies about slicing off my thigh fat to slicing off my breasts. In my teen years, we hated our bodies and we punished them with eating disorders and self-harm. And yes, though spread by wild social contagion, nothing has changed except for the worse. Those practices have now been institutionalized and medicalized. Your doctor will take care of that horrifying female fat with chemical injections, and your surgeon will do the cutting for you. And the federal government will pay for it. And most of the girls who are shunted down that path would grow up to be lesbians. It's the gay and lesbian kids who are being transed. Young lesbians are being gutted of their uteruses, their ovaries shut down, their breasts sliced away, having surgeries to their clitorises, and their vaginas may atrophy, all before they can vote. They should be our next generation of warriors, and the battlefield is instead their female flesh. The loss is not just personal. Lesbians are always the beating heart of women's liberation, and every so often, lesbianism and feminism come together for a brief moment, and there's an explosion across the culture. Women make progress when women love women. It really is that simple. I was there for the last explosion, and it sustains me still. Guy Debord wrote presciently of the society of the spectacle, where, quote, being becomes having, and having is reduced to merely appearing. Instead of inhabiting, quote, the soft animal of your body, as poet Mary Oliver said so sweetly, the body is an object to own, and then to starve or slice, until it approximates the punishing, promising image. Our genitals are now a commodity to be obtained, rather than tissue to inhabit. The exquisite nerve endings, where animal meets angel, severed to create a surgical simulacrum. There is nothing wrong with the animals we are. Especially, there is nothing wrong with anyone's genitals. Not ever. And from this, I will not budge. I'm also not budging from this. No one is born in the wrong body. Your body is yours and a miracle. It's patriarchy that hates you, not me.
You've been able to put your fear aside to, I'm Priya, by the way, from New York. I reached out to you before. I get to see you in person. You've been able to put your fear aside, if not, overcome it to take a public stand. But what would you say to all those people out there who agree, want to say something, but are intimidated, face peer pressure, or to the other extreme, actual violent threats, as you mentioned, rape threats, death threats, fear of losing their job, fear of losing their child, just fear in general, like this sort of McCarthyist climate of fear? How would you encourage people to move beyond their fear?
Do you want to address that to someone in particular?
Well, actually, I think it's relevant to anybody who wants to speak to that. So,
Just one by one, everybody say, why do you do this?
So this is so important. It's just so important. We are literally facing an existential threat to the existence of women and girls as a category. That is not hyperbole. That is not an exaggeration. And, I will lose everything if I have to fight this.
You just have to do it anyway. Like, it is scary. And women, I know personally women who've lost their jobs because of trying to have this conversation, and the threats are scary. And like losing your friend group is scary. Like being ostracized is scary. Like there's so many, I get so many emails from women who live in places throughout the US who feel like they're the only person where they live who feels this way. And it's so isolating and awful, and I feel horrible for these women. But we all have an obligation to speak out again about this, because otherwise nobody else will. Like the more of us who do, the more empowered other people will feel to talk about it. Like we have to do it, and we have to take those risks and do it in your own way. I mean, you don't have to do it in this way. You can do protests, you can do activism. If you're not comfortable with that, do something else. Like, you know, send an email to a politician. After what happened with the Vancouver Public Library, I was copied on dozens and dozens of emails that people had sent to the library complaining about their behavior and their response to our event. People who are librarians who work for the Vancouver Public Library sent letters, which was really scary for them because they work in this place and they could lose their jobs, and they could be, or not lose their jobs and just be bullied and treated horribly at work and have no recourse. Sent emails to the library saying, I support what Megan is saying, I support what these people are saying, I support this conversation, and I'm not okay with your behavior. You have to do something, whatever you can, and it doesn't help to hide out, it doesn't help to stay anonymous. Like, we have to be public in our positions and take risks.
Fear breeds fear. I think we all agree that we're here because we probably all have big mouths generally, but also there's no point. If this concerns you, you have to speak up at this point. And you don't have to speak up on a panel, and you don't have to put your face on TV, but you do need to reach out to your community members, and you have to stop being ashamed of your beliefs, that you have nothing to be ashamed of. You just want to have a conversation at this point.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure,
before
yeah.
we
So I think, and Bree is probably the most expert to speak about this, I really think a lot of people do not understand what is going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? There has been an I lost my words, a tremendous increase in the number of young people, especially girls, who are being medicalized, put on lifelong hormones which cause tremendous harm to their bodies. They put themselves at risk of disease, of permanent sterility at increasingly younger ages. But most of the general public does not know that. And that's another reason I think we just have to be speaking up.
My Lyft driver last night, we got into a conversation, and she has a podcast, and it's focused on women. So we had a talk, and she had no idea that a 13-year-old in our country can go and get a mastectomy, and Medicaid will cover it, or her private insurance will cover it. And it's not being hidden. These aren't surgeons acting in the dead of night. It's you choose one or two things, one or two talking points. Inform yourself and be able to speak about them calmly and rationally, and speak to people, just people in your community.
I don't know if I'm brave. I actually have no idea how I don't know what that means. It's just, I have to say what's true. And I certainly see injustice, and my whole life that has just been the main motivating force. So I can't not do this. And it's amazing to me that other people don't feel that. Clearly they don't, but they don't. So whatever it is in you that motivates, like, you just have to let it come through. So sometimes I just think I'm more stubborn than other people. Like, you're just not gonna get me to say something that's not true. Like, you're just not gonna. Nobody on the planet who doesn't know the difference between a man and a woman. That's not a bad thing, it's just reality, right? You're not gonna get me to say something that isn't true. And that's just, I don't know, between that and just caring about all the profound injustices of the world, I'm just not gonna give up. So I'm sure all of you in you somewhere have that feeling of whatever that passion is, you got it.